Well, I'll just start while people are coming in to say hello and thank you to everyone for joining us, both panelists and witnesses and people taking notes, etc., for the latest of the all-party parliamentary group devolution meetings in our inquiry into devolution and central government. There's a Twitter tag of @APPG Devolution if people would like to tag that when they're talking about this session. I know a few people did for the previous one, which was most appreciated. And we've got quite a lot of witnesses and quite a lot to get through. So I wondered whether I could ask our witnesses to introduce themselves. Is Bronwen on the call now? If not, perhaps Philip, could I ask you to say hello and say a few words about yourself and your interests before we go in further?
Okay, I'm Philip Booth. I'm Professor of Finance, Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University, Twickenham, and Senior Academic Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I've written and researched somewhat on the question of fiscal devolution, localization, and so on, in particular for a short book I wrote called Federal Britain, which was proposing a federal model for the governance of the United Kingdom.
Fantastic, thanks very much for that. And Jim, the CBI, a few words from you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So head of regional policy at the CBI, we represent 190,000 different businesses across all sectors, size of business and regions. Some of you may know we've published a paper called Unlocking Regional Growth, looking at the productivity challenge. We've also published a paper last year on powering up places calling for 60% of the English population to be covered by a devolution deal, and we'll soon be launching a report on reviving regions, looking to how we can have strong local labor markets, transform infrastructure, and ensure that we're getting the investment regionally.
Thanks very much. And Warwick Lightfoot, can I just see the top of your head at the moment, Warwick? There we go. That's slightly better. Do say a few words. You're on mute at the moment.
Is that better for you?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, very good. I'm Warwick Lightfoot. I'm an economist and I'm the head of economics and social policy at Policy Exchange. And I think I'll probably be drawing on some of the work we've done on infrastructure and the future of the union and devolution, which is something Policy Exchange has taken a long interest in. But I find myself in the odd position of having been an advisor at the Treasury when very big changes were made to the financing of local government in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the community charge replaced the rating system, which was then replaced by the council tax. The capping regime went and then was brought back in. There was the VAT switch, there was the Hammersmith and Fulham judgment, and also some of the very important pieces of legislation that if you're on the ground in local government, as I was for 30 years, I found myself implementing, like the 1989 Children's Act and the National Health Service and Community Care Act. So in an interesting way, I've seen it from both ends of the municipal drain pipe.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you for that.
And Andrew, Bronwen here. I am here. The link that your office kindly sent through has identified me as Susan Ryan, which
yes.
I'm not.
You're not.
And we can't change that our end. But I don't know if you can change it your end. Otherwise, I'm going to be here masquerading as Susan Ryan, but in fact, I'm Bronwen Maddox.
Right.
And may I give a health warning? I'm at my mother's house. She's actually really rather ill. And if I suddenly disappear out of it and come back, I'm not being rude. I really do have to go and sort things out.
No, absolutely. Quite understand, Warwick.
Andrew, could I ask you, just because, are you publishing a transcript of this afterwards, or are you actually showing this video? Because if the second, is there any way to get the name attached to me changed?
I think there is, and I think the team at the Connect group are the people who can do that.
Yes, I'll just do that now.
There we go.
Thank you very much indeed.
All right, that's good, because we are recording it, and yeah, it would be a bit confusing, because it's managed to confuse me as chair, let alone anyone else.
Yeah, well,
Fantastic.
almost confused me, doesn't it?
If you click on the three dots and then click on rename, you can rename yourself. Oh,
Okay,
done.
I will
Forget
do
it.
that.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll be
You're
quiet.
done.
Yep. Thank
You
you.
are
well done,
yourself.
brilliant.
Thank you.
Great. Well, let's dive straight in with questions to Bronwen, then, now correctly identified. And I'll start, if I may, and ask you, Bronwen, if you would expand upon this. In terms of the government's approach to devolution, what reforms do you think would enable them to take a more consolidated approach to that devolution?
It's a really interesting question, and there's a lot packed into it. I think the answer is a decision rather than reforms, and that is a decision to press ahead with this. What was going to be a rolling revolution, as we all know, to give England a layer of government between Westminster and local councils, has got stalled, leaving a patchwork of arrangements that we're all very familiar with. And I might come on to that patchwork, because I don't think bespoke is necessarily a terrible outcome. But it's got stalled because there is both a lack of, has been in some areas, a lack of democratic interest, a kind of push from the public, if you like, lack of seeing why they would want it, but also lack of incentive for government at the centre to go any further. And I don't mean that cynically. I don't mean, central government doesn't want to give away power and it's always that way. It seems to me there are some real questions now that can only be answered by a real political decision to go further. And I know the Prime Minister has said that indeed his government wants to go further, but the decisions are not trivial ones about whether things really work better at the devolved level. And that's partly what it seems to me the session very usefully is going to discuss. Often that case is overwhelming, I think. Sometimes it isn't, and housing and indeed transport and the grand scale may be some of those things, and I'll be very interested in the economic evidence later about that. But we do have an opportunity now to see if the government is going to make good on that decision. And as I said, in answer to your question, I think it's more that rather than reforms, plural, that are going to make the difference now. The things that make this a good point are the coronavirus emergency, which is producing lots of instances of things that probably can be much better done at the local level, of which tracing is very likely one. You've got the government's levelling up agenda, which is intimately linked with this. You've got housing to some extent, though I think it's very interesting the government is saying at the moment that a central policy is necessary to force through real change there, something we might discuss. The one to me that's really going to make a difference is social care, where government has said, again, very emphatically, look, we want to solve this. Lots of governments have said this, we really do. And that to me is the one that may well really begin to put some incentive in central government to give away the power and money that hasn't always happened before. So as I said, I'm absolutely not cynical about this. Though I remember Phil Collins writing in the Times, look, every government before an election says it wants to decentralise and then it doesn't. I think the question of incentives pulling two ways. So it's a decision, to come back to your question, rather than lots of reforms plural.
Thank you for that. That leads nicely on to the second question, which Clive, you're going to ask. Over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. The question that it was sort of indicated I might like to ask was about what could be improved in different government departments' approach to devolution. I'm always tempted to slightly rephrase it and say almost everything in some departments isn't that true. And you know, is it experienced that some departments basically, even though the government's been generally committed to this for a number of years, you know, slightly different governments, different formats. But some departments have been at best indifferent and at worst willfully obstructive to this. Is that your feeling?
No, it isn't. I think they've been confused. And in the absence of clear direction, have done nothing, which is not unreasonable. But I think that's different from being obstructive. And that you know, that isn't my sense. They have sometimes been wary of what might happen if power or money were handed out to the local level, and indeed, can you ever get it back? But that isn't my sense, looking at, for example, the transport or environmental questions, or indeed social care. I think, right, you're asking for where could things be improved? Well, I think there are some real questions about transport and how, if you like, green book decisions on investment are made. And that was something that featured in the last general election. And I think that point is right. Again, it's not to caricature the models, which are complex and smart people put much thought into them, but there is a tendency to keep building stuff where the value added and the jargon is high, that is, where there's already a lot of development. And I think there does need to be some thinking about that isn't just a throwing the green book out the window and saying, well, we'll put investment in whatever locality we deem to be desirable. Oh, and we may have an eye on the next election, and so on. So I think there's some real thinking about transport. There is some real thinking about what representation is right for rural areas, because coming back to the patchwork point, I don't think it's necessarily true that we need an absolutely regular model rolled out over the whole country. So combined authorities have worked well. That doesn't mean they're going to work for every part of the country. And there is a question which has remained unanswered about rural areas and what's going to work best for them. And I just think one other thing in this, that you're asking what could be improved in government departments' approach to devolution. Well, they could talk an awful lot more to local areas, and that absolutely goes for the Treasury in this. But I think the current debate about relocating civil servants is perhaps a red herring, because I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's quite a different thing to take groups of people who actually quite properly might be part of what you properly call central government and relocate them around the country. That's quite a different thing from devolution, which is actually putting money and power into the different localities. And that's one thing that I think is conceivably unhelpful in this debate, though there is quite a bit of excitement about it at the moment.
If I could just pursue about two departments. One, yeah, I struggle to think, perhaps you can think of something, that anything that the Department for Work and Pensions has been involved in devolving in the last 10 years. It's sort of hung on like grim death, hasn't it, to everything it always did. And its idea of decentralisation is to agree a bit of consultation here and there with local authorities on certain issues. That's really it. But then you just mentioned then, which I think is important, that the department which has got the lead on devolution to local government, NCLG, in its there has been criticism in its current proposals on planning and housing need, that it is going in the opposite direction quite significantly and producing centralising measures. So for the department which is leading on devolution, is that a conflict that you perceive?
I think the conflict is in the idea, not in the department, if you see what I mean. So I have taken that as very much the thrust of this discussion, that there has been, and many cases should be, a continual pressure towards devolution, that it answers a democratic need and it just gets stuff working better if people at a local level are involved in those decisions. And that's the whole thrust of this. But I think what we're seeing at the moment is some instances when that might not be true. And housing is possibly, at the moment, one of those. It's a really complicated question of why the housing market in England has got so stuck and lumpy, but it may be that decisions by central government to override local planning may be necessary in some cases. It is politically, obviously, immensely contentious. And I think it's something that needs to be explored, but it is a good case of where you have got things pulling in different directions. And you mentioned the DWP. Again, that's one. I mean, it's one. You know, it's a department, vast.
Sorry, I'm just a Zoom devolution call. Can I call you back?
Very, very connected with loads of ordinary lives, and yet you've much maligned universal credit, rightly criticised for years, but the fact that it was got going, working centrally, seems to me, and something the Institute's written about, one of the reasons that in this pandemic, the government was actually able to get quite a lot of money into people's hands very quickly, because that was working and working in a centralised way. It's not one of the great heroic tales of good government, but the centralisation did have an aspect that was beneficial. So I don't think this is a black and white question. It would be much simpler if it were, but where departments feel conflicting forces on them, if you like, they respond, not surprisingly, with rather confused policy. But it's not, the problem is the debate, if you like, rather than the actual departmental process.
Okay, can I move on to Bob's question, and then we'll better move straight on to our next witness if we're going to stay in time. So Bob, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, Bronwen. Nice to see you. I'll resist the temptation to go into housing at the moment, which is almost irresistible, but I will.
Almost irresistible.
Let's assume the government have decided to go for greater devolution for the moment. How should they go about organising the process, and which department is best placed in government to lead that process of devolution?
It's a really, really good question, because you've got so many departments that have a very close role in this, whether DWP, Department of Transport, and of course HCLG. I still, even though you begin your question with assuming that, I find it very hard to get away at this point from saying that this has to be pushed by the centre, and therefore essentially the Cabinet Office and Treasury in this, because this needs decisions, and it needs decisions which amount to giving away the right to do something and the money along with that. And I find it very hard to jump over that step and just say, let's assume that's happened. Then you're into all kinds of departments that are involved. So I don't, this does need impetus. It does need a champion, if you like. Actually, very appropriately, the Prime Minister, to get this kind of change going. And I think we've got quite a long spell where the impetus for this has to be driven by the centre, because it is the centre giving away stuff.
But it's a cross-cutting issue, Bronwen. So
it is.
Typically, these are the hardest things for the central government to do. So I still raise the question about how does government effectively deliver on these cross-cutting agendas, and where do you best lead them? His Cabinet Office is often cited, but it's of course not a big nor a kind of necessarily strong department in terms of its ability to lead across Whitehall. It could be Treasury, of course.
It is, but I'm not sure. You absolutely rightly say that this is a cross-cutting issue, and therefore I'm not sure that answering it with the name of one department does the trick, for exactly that reason. There is no one department whose brief is a sufficiently large part of this to take on that role, other than, if you like, the Cabinet Office. The government could appoint, ministers, or a minister particularly in charge of this. But it seems to me this is so central to what this government says it's trying to do, particularly the levelling up, that I think it's appropriate that the roads, in this case, lead back to the centre, and it's not particularly to officials, it is to the politicians who are putting their name to this, which is the Prime Minister and his closest colleagues. Where that's then driven from, I mean, I would still come back to the Cabinet Office, which has not been great at cross-cutting issues, but better perhaps than other departments trying to, single departments trying to lead issues that inevitably cross quite a bit of Whitehall. There is quite a bit that has happened during the coronavirus emergency, not very smoothly, you might say, but it has happened, to make the Cabinet Office better at dealing with that particular very cross-cutting issue. And this is, along with civil service reform, another cross-cutting issue. this kind of agenda of strengthening the whole country, not just the most prosperous bits, is so central to this government that at least while we've got this government, I don't find it a very satisfactory answer to take the spotlight off the centre.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Just had an eye on the time, so we may come back to some of the issues that you raised, particularly number 10, centralisation versus departmental autonomy. Yeah. But let's bring in Philip at the IEA, and the first question for Philip is from you, Margaret. We need to take you off mute.
I was still muted. Thank you. It's probably because my phone went off. I apologise. What would you say are the main economic impacts of devolution for the devolved areas, those in question, and also for Whitehall?
Well, for the country as a whole, in other words, including the areas of which devolution takes place, the main economic benefit really is an increase in economic efficiency. Now, often we think about this in rather utilitarian accountancy-like terms and think that doesn't sound very exciting, but that really means that you can provide a higher level of services for a given amount of money, or you can provide the same level of services for less money. So it is really quite important. Now, where does that come from? And I think where it comes from actually is quite important too. So first of all, you can get a better matching of what is provided at the local government area by to local preferences. So what is desired in Crawley may not be what is desired in the Outer Hebrides, and if you decentralise those decisions, you can get a better matching of outcomes to preferences. Secondly, you can get competition between local areas if you have more devolution of power. And thirdly, you can also ensure that you could get learning. One local, if different local areas do things in different ways, those which are successful can then be copied by other areas. However, there are some important preconditions for that to work, and the main one that's identified in the evidence is that the local authority needs to be responsible for both raising and spending money. In other words, and it needs to have a broad local tax base so that local politicians and officials are accountable to their local people rather than being accountable upwards to Whitehall and acting as branch offices of Whitehall. And in fact, there is one study which suggests that having a high level of local spending devolution combined with a low level of taxation devolution, which is exactly the position that the UK is in, is actually the worst of all worlds. So the best position is having devolution of tax and spend, second best not having much devolution of it either, and then the third best is to devolve spending but not to devolve taxation, because then local politicians are effectively looking in the wrong direction. They're looking upwards at Whitehall rather than downwards at the local people they are supposed to be serving. And I was really struck, sorry, another aspect of why you get efficiency is because of local knowledge as to what works in a particular local area. When I attended the last APPG meeting of this group, which I don't think I spoke at all, but I was really struck by the number of council officials who were expressing frustration about things they knew would work in their area, but because they were, I think there was one quote of 10 different programs across 8 different departments that they were trying to manage to provide further education services, financed ultimately by central government, they just couldn't do what they knew needed to be done in the local area. So it's aligning spending and taxation, which is crucial in my view.
Thank you. Got a follow-up then from Dorothy.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Hi, Philip. Absolutely following on from that. So how can arrangements for devolution be enhanced to ensure that the combined authorities are actually able to take responsibility for the economic outcomes in their region? I guess this is about responsibility, accountability, collective responsibility. How do we strengthen that?
Yeah, so I would sort of move away from these negotiated arrangements that we have currently, where you have local councils often combining into regions or groups of local councils and then negotiating settlements effectively with the government, which produces a patchwork. It's not a patchwork itself, I don't think, that's necessarily the problem. The UK has always had a patchwork of local government arrangements, and that actually used to work quite well until 1974. But I think the key is to actually have legislative clarity, which I think this needs to be led by legislation rather than led by a bureaucratic and administrative process, which makes clear what the responsibilities of different levels of government are and makes clear the revenue raising responsibilities and the range of taxes that local authorities can use. And as long as there's a broad tax base, I'm not all that worried about what taxes local authorities use, and there's no reason why they might not be able to choose between different tax bases. So I would lead by legislation to clarify, ensure that responsibilities were clarified rather than lead by sort of bureaucratic processes.
Well, we have heard some evidence about a rule book or a concordat or I mean, how do you feel about how rigid or fixed things should be in that sense? Because at the moment you could argue that, you know, it was you can have anything you want, but it has to be a mayor and a combined authority. So how rigid do you feel that needs to be?
Okay. I definitely don't think that the form of local government has to be rigid across the country. If we just take England for the purposes of discussion. And until 1974, it wasn't rigid. It evolved through time, and there were different approaches in place for rural and urban areas, which I think ended up matching local preferences to outcomes very effectively. So I live just outside Hull, in the county of East Yorkshire, and Hull was its own county borough, which provided all the county services. Did very different from things very differently from East Yorkshire, but the residents of both were really pretty satisfied with the outcomes. So the wide differences across the country don't bother me, but what does bother me is that the way these things are determined by negotiation between local authority officials and government officials, because I think that takes power out of the hands of elected representatives and has local officials and local elected representatives looking upwards to Whitehall rather than downwards to their people. So I would sort this out by legislation, but if that legislation that led to a patchwork of different arrangements in different places, that would be okay for me.
Thank you.
Maurice, you have a question now.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Does devolution, you think, risk a greater regulatory burden for local authorities, which in itself could endanger growth if they're sort of over-regulated?
Yeah, you mean imposed by central government in effect? As
part of the devolution deal,
okay.
Regulations and restrictions.
No, sure. No, there certainly is that danger, and you see it in universities. You can be much more free as long as you do things in the ways we describe in this 5,000-page handbook sort of thing. No, I think what is much more important is local accountability. So that's a choice, I think, to devolve and then regulate how devolved power is used. You could actually devolve and cut the apron strings if you wanted to, and allow local authorities to be accountable to the local electorates, which is how it works in most other countries in the world. I might just add one thing. It's about regulation, but a slightly different point. I think lots of areas of regulation could in fact be devolved to local authorities as well. Why are we having national discussions about Sunday shopping hours, for example?
Can I just come back? Yes, that's very useful. Can I just come back? So we talk about local accountability. Does that come through the elected forum? So in other words, I do hear a lot about when you could start neighbourhood groups, you can start groups of people who can come in and be involved in helping local people make decisions. But for me, the accountability is being elected rather than giving them power to groups who actually might not be elected. And I just, for me, I think that's a safety mechanism I'm thinking about.
No, I think the accountability comes from being elected, but it also comes from the group of people that you're electing being responsible for both raising the money to provide public services and providing those public services, not getting the money from somewhere else. And it's when you get the money from somewhere else that central government, of course, wants to regulate how you use this money. You know, we'll give you £1 billion as long as you spend it in this way. If local authorities are raising their own money from a broad tax base, so you don't get the problems that you had in the 1970s. And it kind of works everywhere else in the world.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Just a really quick one, Philip. I know we're a bit tight for time, but I did really want to ask you this. Do you think there's a stronger argument for a more coherent and uniform local government structure in England simply because we have an unwritten constitution combined with local government's reputation amongst Westminster politicians not being as respectful or strong as it is virtually anywhere else that I've ever come across, including my time as an MEP? And what I'm thinking of is, if you look at the Lander or if you look at the states in the United States, I think they draw some of their ability to get things done from the fact that they're actually not there at the whim of central government to redesign. So slightly contradicting myself, if central government then did redesign the whole thing, but actually put it on a constitutional footing, that might actually give local government a lot more clout.
Yes, essentially you'd have, if you like, the rule of law rather than the rule of administrators, because you would set out the constitutional framework and then local authorities would work according to that framework, which we did in the UK, well, up to and beyond 1974. We had a radical reorganisation in 1974, which I think was very unhelpful, but this isn't entirely foreign to the UK either, for various reasons. Margaret Thatcher centralised many aspects of what local authorities did, and they were quite good reasons. But that doesn't mean to say that we have to live with that legacy forever. We can go back to an approach which worked historically in the UK and which works in nearly every other country in the world, of having genuine local accountability.
No, thank you. I just wanted to get that on the record, really. May come back to you, Philip. Thank you. Turning to Jim at the CBI, I know Clive's got a meeting, so I wonder if, Clive, you could ask Jim your question first, and then I'll ask mine.
Okay, so thanks very much, Andrew. That's really helpful. Appreciate it. Jim, obviously, you probably can't speak for business as a whole. Businesses may have different views themselves about devolution, but in essence, as I've sort of felt it over the years, some businesses seem to think that it's better if the centre lays down what should be done in every part of the country, so business knows where they stand, they get consistency. And other areas will say, well, actually what we need is local council we can go to, who can actually make some decisions about things rather than have to refer everything up to a department in Whitehall. Which is the prevailing comment about devolution that you think really reflects business on this issue?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I mean, as you'd expect, there isn't going to be a 100% agreement on this or any other topic across the entirety of the business community. But I do think it is accurate to say that business is largely supportive of devolution in England, recognizing the role that it plays in putting the power and funding needed to address, some of the big challenges we face, such as lagging productivity, into the hands of those closest to those issues. In the past, most businesses were probably agnostic. For example, they'd want a bridge to be built to improve connectivity in a community. They were probably less interested in how that bridge is built. Though increasingly businesses are recognizing the value of empowering local communities to make decisions for themselves. We've been able to consult members across the CBI that encompasses all sizes, all sectors, all geographies, and increasingly the conclusion is that local communities should have more power, not less. So I mentioned the Powering Up Places report we published last year. it had called for, developing and publishing a clear framework so that you're able to assess current and future deals, clearly define functional economic areas, optimizing Westminster and Whitehall so that they're better prepared, going back to some of the earlier questions about, whether there should be ministerial champions across government departments, reviewing the Green Book, working more closely with mayors, and then as well as sort of really one of the strong sentiments from business was that, okay, get on with it. So how can we deliver new deals? How can we ensure that 60% of the country, 60% of the English population is covered by a deal by 2025? So yeah, I mean, there's not going to be 100% agreement, but I think increasingly, if you look to the big challenges that we face, whether it be COVID, Brexit, productivity, I think increasingly businesses see the value of empowering those leaders on the ground.
You just follow up. I mean, obviously, business has a particular interest of its own in what devolution might deliver, and you mentioned sort of economic connectivity there. So does business feel then it's important the geographical area that should be the power should be devolved to, and that should reflect local economic activity? Is that something that's of concern to business?
Yeah, I mean, I think an obvious result of devolution is complexity, right? And businesses will mention complexity in a range of different ways. But yeah, defining a functional economic area is sort of something that businesses would very much welcome. You could look to the issues that we faced in relation to local enterprise partnerships, not aligning to the boundaries of mayoral combined authorities, which are beginning to be resolved in some cases, but certainly there are examples where that hasn't yet been resolved. So absolutely, I think that if you're sort of aligning boundaries in places like the West Midlands, for instance, I think businesses would widely welcome that approach.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe.
Thank you, Clive. To sort of go along with that, sort of the twin of Clive's question is mine to you, Jim, which is to say, what reforms to Whitehall's approach to devolution do you think would best support business?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in one word, I think it's clarity. We all appreciate the scale of the twin challenges of the pandemic and our future outside the EU, but I think government needs to urgently publish this devolution and local recovery white paper. That should include details on a clear framework for devolution to ensure transparency about any new deals, and as well as clear measures for success. It should also pave the way to ensure that, as I said earlier, that 60% of England is covered by a deal in 5 years' time. But I guess as well, in addition to more deals, I think further devolution is also vital. So devolution in its current form has been described as delegation. Areas should be sufficiently empowered to deliver against specific local and regional demands. This will allow areas to benefit from the opportunity of a place-based approach opposed to the traditional siloed approach that has too often been used. So for example, recognizing the links between poor education attainment and health deprivation and delivering solutions relevant to that particular place. For those areas without a devolution deal, I think the framework for devolution will be key to setting out a roadmap for more and further powers. Though in the meantime, we could work to ensure that local enterprise partnerships and growth hubs have the resourcing capacity to develop and deliver recovery plans, for instance, as well as ensure that all parts of the country have a powerhouse and or engine style body that helps develop a long-term and coherent vision for their pan-regional areas.
No, I'm reminded of Stanley Baldwin's quote about the press in the 1930s, which was power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot across the ages. And yet with local government, it seems to be exactly the opposite, which is responsibility without power. Now, what that's the prerogative of, I don't know, but I'm hoping this inquiry will assist us in finding out. So, Margaret, you are going to ask Jim the next question. And you're on mute. Can we?
I can't hear.
Can we take? Can I ask our colleagues at Connect to take Margaret off mute, please? There we are.
I think I wasn't aware I had another question of Jim, I must say. I am interested in his, particularly when he represents the CBI. Does the CBI also reflect the views of the many small businesses who we find in our areas that are not necessarily part of the large organisations that the CBI represents?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pleased to say we do represent the small businesses as well. So I think there is often the perception that we only represent the large multinationals and others, which are, of course, certainly a part of our membership. But yeah, we, in addition to our councils across the organization, we have an SME council that, for instance, has been heavily involved in the Reviving Regions report that I had mentioned earlier. So yeah, all sized businesses are incorporated into our thinking.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. So we'll come back to you, Jim, but I want to bring in Margaret's next question straight away, which is to Warwick at the Policy Exchange. Margaret, back to you.
Is improved control over funding and fiscal decentralisation key to the success of devolution?
Yes, and it's very difficult to get right, because to explore this question is an exploration of tensions and difficulties rather than routes of resolution. The chairman, quite rightly in my view, pointed out that people who participate in local government, particularly elected members, really are not regarded as playing a significant part in British politics. This is a very unusual thing to British political culture. And when local government first started to get given complicated and potentially expensive things to do in the 19th century, it had a very limited tax base, domestic rates and business rates, and it wasn't a buoyant tax base. The central government had the buoyant tax base that principally came from income tax. And so very quickly, Exchequer Grant had to pay for Foster's Education Act and all the other things we've done in the 20th century. Now, this was completely the reverse of what happened in other countries. So, for example, Germany didn't have a federal or Reich income tax until, I think, 1913. So the tax-raising powers were with Saxony, Bavaria, and Brandenburg, Prussia. They weren't in the federal authorities' hands. So the provincial authorities could experiment in education, provision of public services and so on, in a way that simply wasn't available to a county borough or a shire county in England and Wales in the 19th century. And that has run throughout. Now, I agree absolutely with Philip. There's a real problem when you get given money and you spend it and you don't have the responsibility for raising it. And people in Britain have understood this all the way through. When Irish Home Rule was being discussed in 1912, there was the Primrose Inquiry into funding it, and they made the point that the Home Rule in Ireland wouldn't have the revenue to finance it, and the transfer payment was going to create a problem. Probably the most important piece of local authority finance analysis, in my view, still remains Frank Layfield's report, published some 44 years ago. And they make this point very strongly. If you spend money you don't have responsibility for it, you will not spend wisely. And the difficulty is that English local government and devolved authorities simply do not have a buoyant tax raise to extract revenue from, which is why the Layfield inquiry suggested the introduction of a supplementary local income tax. We've now got a further problem, which is compared with the early 1970s, when Frank Layfield was told off to go and do his report. The dispersion of economic activity and the dispersion of tax base we have throughout the United Kingdom has increased, and you've got pockets of great dynamism and potential rich tax raising opportunities in the southeast of England and London, and then where I'm speaking from in Plymouth and down the road in Cornwall and in other parts of the country, no matter what tax raising powers you've got, you haven't got the tax base to actually do it. And unfortunately, there's not a neat correlation between that tax base and potential social need. And I think that the challenge is, how do we actually ensure that we give greater discretion, greater responsibility, and at the same time ensure that you have some rough reasonable equivalence of service across the country.
Yes.
Thank you.
Quite.
So Dorothy,
I
think you lead on from that nicely, actually.
Yeah, although I'd love to have the discussion with Warwick about the Barnett formula, but perhaps that's not for now. Warwick, the current deals are all based on, you know, you get the feeling it's that power's being devolved because of a necessity, trying to solve a problem, which seems to be related to growth and infrastructure. Do you believe that's helpful or a hindrance, or should areas be allowed to choose their own priorities, or should it be on social services such as welfare or health, or more open?
Well, my own view is that English local government has become so centralised and so distorted by central guidance. I know since 2010 there's been something of a relaxation, but the big difficulty is that, and the advice I would give to Whitehall departments, have a sense of proportion. I think you do need very strict controls and regulation of those things that could knock a local community for six if they had an authority that leveraged, borrowed, reopened the Hammersmith and Fulham case with derivative instruments. None of us want to be Orange County or the residents who live there. So I think that there's some things you've got to be very strict over. There are other things you don't want social services inspectorates and central government advisors telling you how to organise the menus in a mental health day centre. And that actually happens. I've actually gone through it with an inspector talking to me about being concerned at the choices made by the users of a mental health day centre. The other thing you've got to avoid in the centre is having an E-day fix about how something should be done. And I've certainly seen this in Care in the Community. Care in the Community is a policy I very strongly supported. And it was always understood there would be people living in the community who would need a lot of help. Of course, most authorities were not able to provide that kind of supported residential accommodation with the multidisciplinary teams you actually need. But where it was done, often the inspectors would come and say, do you know what? We really think you should be moving those people on. And yet there were people with very acute mental health diagnosis where there was going to be no progression. And so the very authorities that had complied with the original guidance with an agenda of cost saving were forced to actually modify the services they were delivering. So I think that what Whitehall has got to do is look to the really big things they need to stand back from and say, no, you mustn't do that. And then on most other things, let go. And as Philip was saying, if you have top-down E-day fixed policies, which may make sense in some authorities, they don't in others. So when my authority was given a lot of money for preventative work in child protection, we already did a lot of that. Quality protection wasn't any help, but there were other things, particularly in older people's social care, where we simply had underfunded budgets that needed to be adjusted. And it's actually giving local authorities the discretion, whether it's a regional authority or a conventional local authority of the sort we're used to, whoever's making the decisions should be allowed freely to make those decisions without their homework being checked as they go.
Yeah,
I think we always have arguments about whether grants should be ring-fenced or not, so that will be a perennial argument. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Warwick. And yeah, it reminds me of the time when we were creating local enterprise partnerships and we wanted to put in big bids, and then the government announced that it wanted people to do a case study, and then announced that we all had to put bids in for the bid, which actually cost more money than they were actually prepared to hand out in the first place. Extraordinary. Yeah. Anyway, Maurice, you want to ask the next question?
Maurice has had to leave, I think.
Because Maurice had to go. Oh, shame. Okay, I'll ask it. So, Warwick, then I'll ask Maurice's question. Is the focus on devolving powers related to growth and infrastructure rather than social services such as welfare and health still appropriate?
I just asked that, Chair.
I think we've moved on downwards.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, mine are in the wrong order. Sorry, I'm... yeah, so...
Maurice
very quickly,
was Mark's first question.
There's of course, there's a muddle between the two in the sense that some of the things that you associate with... I think there's a lot of scope to devolve parts of the DWP remit in terms of active labour market measures, and it would be very good to involve local authorities and regional decision makers in things that actually shape their labour markets, most of which lie with DWP. So I think there's a lot of scope to do that. In terms of social care and social services, I think that the interesting thing there is, and we might come back on this later on, is for how long are the health budgets, and is the National Health Service going to be a centralised service that does things to the rest of us, completely devoid of local initiative? And when will local councillors and accountable people begin to get in there and say, no, we want to do something differently here and do something genuinely differently? And I think it's very interesting how the public health agenda, it's been fascinating. Initially, public health was given back to local government, I think 8 years ago. And yet in the crisis, we didn't make full use of that devolution to local authorities. And my understanding is they've done quite well.
Yeah, and could have done better if they'd been given the opportunity. But yeah, absolutely.
Earlier,
yeah, quite. I suppose we're all a bit trade union with this, and we would say that, wouldn't we? But it's still true. So thank you, Warwick. We'll come back to you. And Mark, I'm sorry I got everyone else to introduce themselves at the beginning and not yourself. So perhaps you could say a few words about yourself first, and then I'll ask you a question.
Thank you, Chair. My name's Mark Sandford. I'm the local government specialist in the House of Commons Library. I'm just to be clear, I'll be not speaking for the library today, but speaking under my own steam, so to speak. And I should also be clear that I'm, unlike many of the other witnesses today, I'm not an economist. My interests are around governance and structures and how devolution in England functions. So much of what I have to say will be around that, I think.
Well, thank you, Mark. And you can be assured from my point of view that I won't be holding your not being an economist against you. So could I ask you to have a think about this and say, what's the significance of 2021 in particular to English devolution, and how has that been affected by coronavirus?
I think there are three things I want to draw people's attention to around this question. I think the main effect of coronavirus, to address that question first, has been to build mayors' public profile. And they're getting unprecedented attention from national media and from people associated with the Westminster Village, if I can put it that way. And I think that leap in public profile will have far stronger bearing on what happens to devolution in England in 2021 than what mayors actually do and what they can do, which on the whole is still pretty negligible. I think much of what happened in the recent shenanigans over the past 6 weeks around the negotiations around lockdown is about optics for both local and central government. I think the government wanted to appear to be working with local partners, and mayors wanted to appear to have some purchase over what was being done to them. So it was really about perceptions. And I think that's quite an interesting point, because it throws into relief one of the contradictions of English devolution, which is that it has always been the rhetoric about decentralising decision-making and power has always run ahead of the reality, and that there have always been long-standing structures in place that prevent decentralisation of decision-making actually taking place, and which also have the effect of choking off control over funding. So that's one point. And secondly, the white paper, I have to mention, this was first promised in 2017. We're now expecting it in spring 2021, I think. I'm pretty pessimistic about the white paper, I always have been. I don't think it will provide the type of clarity that other colleagues have said it should, around what should the clear powers be, what should the process be for devolution in England, what are the success criteria. I would have expected it to mirror previous practice, to offer very limited funding to local areas and eye-wateringly tight accountability and assurance requirements. And I think with those two features in place, in a way, it doesn't really matter what powers are on offer, because it won't be possible for mayors to exercise them to any great effect. And I don't incidentally buy the idea, which I've seen in a few places, that this is going to be the case because of the way Andy Burnham has behaved. I think these are structural features of English government, and I say English government intentionally. And I think those structural features are and will turn out to be stronger than the political importance, which a previous speaker mentioned, of levelling up to this government. Now, thirdly, I think, and possibly most significantly, I think the elections in 2021, if we get them, we're going to have 6 mayoral elections. We're also going to have elections in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I think we could well see a narrative develop about shifts towards localism and popularity of the local, popularity of devolution, loss of faith in central government. And it will be interesting to see how that narrative, how far that narrative cuts through with the public. And I think it's also worth mentioning the politics of devolved elections. Based on recent polling, if I was the mayor of Tees Valley or the mayor of West Midlands, I wouldn't be too confident at the moment going into this election. I can well imagine that we could end up with a lot of mayors all across England of a different political colour to the national government, and that would give the central local relationship a very marked political flavour that it's not had in quite the same way up till now.
Right, no, thank you, Mark. Do Margaret or Dorothy want to chip in at that point, or shall I go on to the next question that we'd intended?
Well, as a former directly elected mayor, I always felt that I was selling the sizzle, not the sausage, because I felt that I absolutely agreed that I didn't have the powers to actually deliver. But yet, with the role, people expected you to. I remember an argument in the street with somebody who said, "Don't tell me you can't tell the police what to do." And I had to explain that even in our own town centre, I couldn't do that. So I'm particularly interested to what you feel are the biggest stumbling blocks to further devolution. And perhaps it's too easy to say it's the politicians, but from your perspective, what is it?
I take quite an odd view on this. I think that one of the biggest stumbling blocks to further devolution is the whole concept of accountability, which we've touched on to some extent up till now. But I think central government, civil servants have a very, very particular view of what constitutes parliamentary accountability, financial accountability. And in that view of the world, it's entirely justified to if you're going to devolve power, to have widespread assurance requirements of whoever you devolve it to. And frankly, it would be better if you didn't have to devolve it in the first place. I think that, and I really think that it's not simply a matter of default reflex centralism in that way of seeing the world. It's about protecting public money, and that's quite an important obstacle which doesn't really get talked about. And I think for substantial devolution of power to take place, somehow that obstacle has to be overcome. I mean, one way of doing it is the type of fiscal devolution that colleagues have talked about, but then again, as one colleague mentioned, there are difficulties around that to do with equity and redistribution as well. So it's by no means panacea.
Could I ask you something slightly different, Mark? But given your House of Commons role, and do you think there's a difficulty in the almost complete overlap of legislative and executive within the House of Commons? Not allowing enough space for local government, in the sense that members of Parliament feel that they have some sort of executive responsibility for their local area almost constantly, rather than being legislators, which is what they're actually supposed to be doing.
I'm not sure if I dare answer that question. My experience of members, and with the greatest respect to all members on this call, is that is certainly true. That members take a close interest in their local authority and their constituency, as you would expect, and I think members would not easily give up the right to intervene in their local area as they saw fit.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. People got very used to that. I mean, I'm just speaking purely personally. I would quite like the opportunity from time to time to have enough confidence and clarity locally, and local government to be sufficiently empowered for me to reply to people saying, that isn't my responsibility, that's what the council does. But with the sort of Westminster fetishism that we tend to have, certainly in England, then the response to that wouldn't be, oh yes, obviously, thank you very much, that I didn't realise that as a member of parliament you're not responsible for the fact my bin hasn't been collected. It would be, how dare you say that to me, you're my member of parliament, why don't you get on with it and get it sorted out?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask Mark one final question specifically to you, and then we'll just have a final little roundup for all of our panelists, because I've got my eye on the clock here. And that, I think you've answered it to some extent, but you may want to sort of slightly expand on it, which is this sort of menu with specials idea to devolution deals. Do you think this idea of offering devolution in that sort of sense has been effective in any way, or does it need to be completely rethought or tweaked around?
No, thanks. It's an interesting question, this one. I mean, I think that the menu with specials approach was definitely justified in the early days of devolution. I can remember George Osborne giving a speech in about 2015 or so, saying absolutely explicitly, this, if I had to start with Manchester in order to get anything through Whitehall in the first place, if I tried to do it everywhere, I'd never have got it off the ground. And I think that's a completely justified viewpoint, and I think it's probably correct. And it also serves as a useful way of proving the concept of devolution, proving the concept of an elected mayoralty spanning several local authorities. There's also an argument which did the rounds a few years ago, which is that having a deal-based approach encourages local areas to think about what they actually want to do. And I know from many conversations in 2015, 2016, that a lot of local authorities came to government at that time and said, here's our devolution deal, we'd like to have what Greater Manchester has, that's it. And when they were asked what you're going to do with it, how are you going to deliver something extra, they didn't really know the answer. So I think there was certainly some justification in the early days for the menu with specials approach and the deal approach. However, I think that by now it has probably run its course. I agree with the previous speaker, I can't remember who it was, I'm afraid, who said that what's needed is legislative clarity. Because I think over time, negotiation of deals from a sort of menu set by government is not a good process. It's not very transparent. That damages democratic legitimacy, which is important ultimately to the success of this agenda. It's not very efficient because months can be spent negotiating a deal, quote unquote negotiating, which really is an 80% off the shelf topic. I mean, I've for my sins, I've read all these devolution deals, and there are whole paragraphs which are literally copied and pasted between them. And I think the more different deals you have, the harder it is for central government to keep track of what it's committed to and what should be happening.
No, that's a good point. I suppose you end up asking the Mayor of Manchester to do something and then expecting the Mayor of Tees Valley to do it, but that particular thing hasn't been devolved to him. It's hard to track. Yes, Margaret.
Could I just say, Andrew, I'm always interested when people talk about Greater Manchester and the whole area of how that devolution worked. It was the easiest place to do it because politically and in terms of geography and size and types of metropolitan districts, it was an easy fit. You can't transfer that somewhere else entirely and think it will work because of local circumstances. And I think my question is, how much can you do it as a design on a piece of paper, and how much have you to recognise the differences in communities and so on, because there's some disasters that we still have from the 1974 reorganisation. So, you know, there's more to it than just saying this will work, because this is how Manchester did it. And I think, you know, there needs to be much more flexibility in how we look at this.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no, I think that's just a worthwhile point to put on the record of our evidence gathering, that one actually. I'm just going to read something Philip put up in the Zoom chat, just so that that's on the record as well, because I think it's a useful piece of evidence. And then I'm going to ask all my panelists if they have any further questions to any of our witnesses, or any witness in particular if they want to pinpoint one. So Philip writes, in 2011, there were 1,300 local authority statutory duties. And that is also a recipe for capture by paid officials, because they are the only people who understand what local authorities are supposed to do. And I'll underline that anecdotally in planning, particularly 12 years on a planning committee, members very rarely got anywhere with planning, because planning officers always knew more about incredibly complex planning regulations than the elected members did, and the officers quite enjoyed that state of affairs, I think. So could I then ask Bob and Margaret and Dorothy if they've got any questions to any particular of our witnesses, or to our witnesses in general? Dorothy, do you want to start?
No, I just want to know if there's anything, having heard the discussion, that they feel they haven't said, anything, you know, that they want to challenge or to correct or add.
Yes, that's a very good point. So does anything burning at the moment for any of our witnesses that they want to make sure is put on the record at the end of this session now? So let's start with you, Bronwen.
Thanks very much. That was a fascinating discussion. Thanks. I wanted to pick up one point that Mark made, which I think is absolutely right, and that if this is going to get impetus, which I very much hope it does, some of it may be driven by people saying, we want this. And it may well be that the elections of next year and the amount of attention around that just do something to increase the demand there, the desire for more of these deals, which have sounded very, very abstract to people. And yet if they can see that they're working in some areas, they may call for more of them. I think Mark's point also that the central government, not just this one, but maybe any, might look at that with a bit of a leery eye, is absolutely right, because it is handing away power in some ways, but I think this thing isn't static, and I think the momentum is to very much to look at how decisions can be made locally, and you can feel people pulling at different ways of this, but I think the next year could bring some momentum on it. I agree with Mark also, perhaps not centrally through the white paper.
Thank you very much, Bronwen. Philip, anything finally to add? You're on mute just at the moment.
Just to refer to housing, which I think Bronwen brought up at the beginning, but I'm not sure has been discussed much since. This is another effort, of course, of pushing water uphill with the government's sort of approach to housing, where local authorities still don't really get much of the benefit from allowing housing, and yet the government is quite rightly desirous of ensuring that much more housing is built everywhere. Again, if you had a much broader local authority fiscal base, local authorities wouldn't just get the costs of housing without any of the benefits. So you build another house, and eventually when that house is built and occupied, you'll get some council tax from it, which in some areas will be a small proportion of local revenue. In Germany, you build a house and you start, or you give planning permission, and you start raising taxes from that development or potential development immediately, and those taxes match this spending, which will eventually come with the additional people who are brought into the area.
Good point. Jim, anything to add? Jim Hubbard, yes?
Yeah, I mean, I really briefly, I think Bronwen sort of started the conversation looking to what sort of leadership may be required across government departments. And I think, as she had mentioned, I think it is absolutely cross-cutting and sort of starts with the Cabinet Office and working across all the different government departments. Though I would just have to acknowledge that you know, it is very much dependent upon Treasury, and you can just look to sort of the departure of George Osborne some time ago that clearly is linked to the momentum of devolution being slowed quite dramatically. Also, we didn't really touch on the topic of fragmentation potentially across the different landscapes for businesses in particular, which I think sort of it would be interesting to pick this up in future conversations. But there is a long list of benefits of devolution, there's no question, but we shouldn't just devolve for the sake of it. So I think we have to have sort of an open conversation as to what power is most naturally fit at the national level versus the region versus the local level. Because very much devolution should be an important element of the leveling up agenda. But at the same time, there's a lot that Westminster and Whitehall can do, whether it be looking at the Green Book, you know, more evenly distributing R&D, etc. And I guess just really quickly on the fragmentation point, you know, there are advantages to devolving powers that perhaps doesn't get enough acknowledgement, and that is the fact that you can test what works. And if it works well somewhere else, you can maybe test it somewhere else with some modification. But on the other side, of course, there's no question that devolution leads to complexity. So it's like it's how do you weigh those costs and benefits to it that I think will be important in the months ahead.
Thank you very much, Jim. Warwick.
I'll just say three things. First, I think that all devolved authorities in England and also the national devolution settlement should be subject to effective audit and policy analysis after the event. I think the National Audit Office does an extremely good job on central government. Local government is under-examined after it does things. In my view, local government's much better at consulting and analysing things before it does things, compared to the Secretary of State producing his white paper, saying it's going to transform something, and it just sails through. But I think the National Audit Office is very good at going afterwards. I'd like to see good, comprehensive, compare and contrast analysis of what all the devolved authorities are doing. The next thing I'd like to see is greater recognition that local government has an effective accounting framework with much better information about unit costs and deployment of resources than central government does. If you take a central government department out, like the Metropolitan Police, and put it into the Greater London Assembly, they have no unit cost information. You take public health out of the Department of Health and put it into local government, similar things regarding their very complex contracts. And I think that it's time, if you like, for local authority finance officers to bite their opposite numbers in Whitehall departments. The third thing I'd say that relates to that and to the public health agenda is that you see huge variation in spending on public health compared with need. So what Kensington Chelsea has, compared with where I'm sitting here in Plymouth, is completely out of sync with needs and spending. Now that was supposed to be corrected. I don't think very much progress has been made with it. And if I may say so, it's part of a wider issue of unbalanced resources within the National Health Service and the regions. If you have a doctor in Notting Hill, as I do, you can have access to a consultant much more quickly than if you live in Winchester, Plymouth, Exeter, or on Merseyside. And I think this whole issue of resources within the National Health Service, which is a very substantial part of the budget, and democratic control over it, is one that should be placed on the agenda.
Thank you, Warwick. And maybe the social care funds changes may provide a window of opportunity for that. So Mark, your final thoughts.
Thanks. Just a couple of things which are linked. One is that one of the things hobbling English devolution at the moment is the fact that a large amount of their funding comes from short or medium term programs that last 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. They have next to no funding which comes on an annual recurring basis, and that creates big problems for building any organizational capacity when you don't know what you're going to be paid to do 3 or 4 years down the line. My other point, which is a more abstract one, is that I think it's absolutely clear that to date government views English devolved bodies as delivery arms of central government rather than any kind of sort of power constitutional rebalancing aid. Now, in one sense, that's fine. That's their prerogative. But if that is what devolved bodies are there to do, it's important that a relationship, a clear relationship, is maintained over time, and that has been far from evident since 2016. I think the agenda has lurched all over the place, and I think to recap on something that Bronwen said, clarity is needed and a decision is needed. That's the most important thing that 2021 could bring.
Superb. Well, thank you all very much. We're over time, but it was worth it to get all of those comments in. We have another session next week when we're actually starting to talk to elected mayors and get a bit of a view from them about what central government is helping them with and not helping them with. I look forward to that session. I look forward to seeing my panelists again then. And for our witnesses today, we're extremely grateful for your time and contribution. And we look forward to being in touch with you further as the inquiry progresses. Thank you.
Here, here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.